workshop. It's the CPR-CSH collaboration, which has been going on for really long, in which we have a talk on urban issues on the last Tuesday of every month. My name is Mukta Naik. I work at the Center for Policy Research, and it's my pleasure to welcome Marie Huchzermeyer today to our talk. I've been avidly following her work for a very long time because I'm interested in informal rental housing, and she's one of the few scholars globally who started work on this many years ago. But today's talk is something that interests a wider audience in the sense that it intersects the idea of informal settlement upgrading, which is something that a lot of scholars have been studying across the global South. And also with the notion of governance and understanding the state. And in this case, she's looking at the state from below as a concept. So this is really exciting for us. Marie, welcome very much. Welcome, and really happy to have you on the talk today. The format we usually follow is about 40-45 minutes of your presentation, and then question and answers. And I'd encourage people to drop in question and answers in the Q&A box as and when you think of them, and we can collate them later, and if time permits, invite you to ask them yourself. I'm handing over to you, Marie, and looking forward to hearing you speak.
Wonderful, thanks so much. I really look forward to this from the other side of the globe. I'm going to share my presentation. So if you bear with me 1 minute. Just maximize it. Is everybody able to see this?
We see it.
Perfect. Okay. Yes, so I am going to take you through quite a dense presentation. I realized as I was preparing this how much actually material there is, and it's always difficult to select. I'll briefly introduce the two informal settlements, and then I'll explain South African housing policy and where informal settlement upgrading fits within that. I'll then just explain the Center for Urbanism and Built Environment Studies cubes and the way we work, because that relates to this study, and I'll then continue with talking about the two informal settlements, their common trajectory, but also the divergence and what that means. I'll end off hopefully with some reflections on this. So the two informal settlements are located in Johannesburg Metropolitan Municipality. In the Greater Johannesburg area. Slovo Park is across the highway from Eldorado Park. You'll see it down there in the bottom left. And it's Eldorado Park is a former apartheid era colored township, that's what it's called, and forms part of the southern end of Soweto in the Johannesburg Metropolitan Municipality. And Harigwala, which is way on the west, on the right-hand side of the slide, borders on the former apartheid-era African township of Wattville, which is close to a former white town of Benoni, and for that reason was that the whole of Wattville was under eviction threat during apartheid, and all of that is in what is now the Ekurhuleni Metropolitan Municipality. So the two municipalities border seamlessly onto one another and form the Greater Johannesburg area. The two informal settlements are at a considerable distance from the centrally located Wits University. I've shown you on the slide there where we are based. As the crow flies, Slovo Park is 20 kilometers and to the southwest, and Harigwala 30 kilometers to the east. Both informal settlements formed in the early 1990s during the last years of apartheid rule. Both resulted from organized occupations, informally planned in a way that mimicked surrounding formal layouts. Both were born out of a strong expectation that the state would accept and legalize the layouts. In the case of Harigwala, the community forum holds a letter from the Wattville Council dated 1991, which permits the occupation for residential purposes. Both settlements are located largely on state-owned land, but also occupy surrounding parcels of land. The layouts, as I said, are orderly, and from that perspective, both settlements are eminently upgradable in situ. They are attached to existing infrastructure and amenity, and in the case of Slovo Park, adjacent to an industrial area with employment opportunities. Both settlements are also surrounded by large tracts of unused land, including sensitive wetlands. In both settlements, some households have livestock which graze in the area. Both informal settlements have long-standing representative leadership endorsed by the residents at large. The Harigwala Civic Committee deals on a daily basis with community disputes and social needs, while also driving improvement of the settlement. It forms part of the wider Wattville Steering Committee, and in its activism, it takes on struggles such as the long-delayed titling of plots in the adjacent formal areas. The Slovo Park Community Development Forum consists of a similar grouping of long-serving committed leaders, but also entails an intricate spatial and thematic structure, which involves over 100 residents in different leadership roles. Both informal settlements are large. Once the representative community organization entered into a trajectory with the municipality that was to see development on the occupied land, they sought to stabilize household numbers and discourage further influx in the form of tenants. Harigwala is around 2,000 households and Slovo Park 3,700. Original occupants staked out plots, and many plots contain secondary and even tertiary structures housing tenants as well as relatives. While the community organizations are seeking to achieve inclusivity of all residents, there is also a certain level of transience. Before I expand on the development trajectory of the two informal settlements and what this has required of the respective settlement leadership committees in terms of navigating the state bureaucracy from below, I will explain briefly South African housing policy as it relates to informal settlements, such as Slovo Park and Harigwala. I will also explain the approach that Cubes, the center within which this action type research is located. So I'll explain the approach we take there. So turning first to the housing policy. South African housing policy includes an upgrading of informal settlements program. This was adopted in 2004 after an extensive review of the policies adopted and implemented in the ANC-led government's first decade in rule from 1994. This review found shortcomings with the mass rollout of fully subsidized one-size-fits-all housing, often targeted at households in informal settlements and mostly requiring relocation to distant locations. The program, the informal settlement upgrading program introduced into South African policy in 2004, and thus forming part of South African law, prioritizes in situ upgrading that is fully inclusive of all occupiers, sensitive to the lives of impoverished households, involves minimal disruption to people's lives, and treats relocation as a last resort. It requires that interim basic services are a first step towards permanent services in a layout that is as far as possible based on the existing settlement pattern. Cabinet approved this together with a larger refocusing of housing policy towards sustainable human settlements. This entailed diversifying the housing policy instruments, also responding to the need for low-income rental accommodation in urban areas. In subsequent years, national, provincial, and local government renamed their housing departments human settlements departments. With this, the themes of urban integration and overcoming the spatial legacy of apartheid sought to be elevated. From 2012 onwards, other departments at a national level also also promoted these themes. The national department responsible for cooperative governance adopted an integrated urban development framework in 2016. And the Treasury developed new grant systems to support implementation, and the National Department responsible for urban and regional planning also concluded a protracted reform of planning legislation, ushering in a new planning decision-making system that empowers local government and spatial planning. Also, these policies and instruments, across these policies and instruments, and in alignment with policies promoted by UN Habitat, informal settlement upgrading is treated as a priority. Changing the trajectory for informal settlements, however, has been slow and remains a concern currently, for instance, of quite a high-level engagement facilitated by Cities Alliance at the moment. The upgrading of informal settlements program with relocation as a last resort is the legally applicable program for all informal settlements. However, informal settlements with few exceptions are still planned and entirely reshaped to conventional town planning layouts driven by standardized housing delivery. In a bid to change this course, Treasury has a direct grant to municipalities for this purpose. However, poor communication about this new funding system and how it relates to the upgrading of informal settlements program, which is part of legislation, and which draws its funding through the human settlement budget allocated to provincial governments, left municipal officials paralyzed. Adding to this confusion over informal settlement upgrading, officials and their consultants mistakenly interpret densification as a directive of the Integrated Urban Development Framework of 2016. They understand this as overriding the core principles of the upgrading of informal settlements, including relocation as a last resort. Thus, typology-driven redevelopment sees informal settlement residents moved to transit camps. Subsequently, displacement results from housing allocation criteria that are applied once units are ready for occupation, and that is often many years later. And further displacement results from widespread corruption in the housing allocation system. Very few informal settlement communities have realized the right to full inclusion in an in situ upgrading process, to have disruption to their lives minimized, and for relocation to be treated as a last resort. So turning then to Cubes. This research is located in Cubes, a collective located in the School of Architecture and Planning at Wits University. It combines activism, grounded research, and pedagogy. I will briefly set out these modes as they relate to the two informal settlement trajectories, and because they will be interesting to the centers hosting the seminar as well. Activism in Cubes has typically involved submissions on various draft strategies, policies, and legislation, collaboration with human rights organizations in opposing policies and interventions that are unconstitutional, awareness raising and furthering of debates through public events, as well as advice to representative community organizations in informal settlements and their relationship in their relationship with government. The latter has involved long-term commitments with relationships evolving over time and not following any preconceived formula. Thus, our modality has been different in Harigwala and in Slovo Park informal settlement. Grounded research in Cubes has taken different forms. One has involved large school-wide commitments to one area for a set period of time. These city studios have been located in formal but highly dynamic areas with strong pedagogic potential. They have involved students across the School of Architecture and Planning, both undergraduate and postgraduate, researching diverse aspects with attempts to channel this research into outputs that are useful for community organizations. This is a book that has recently appeared out of this initiative. So this is just a little pointer to that. We have avoided locating these large engagements within informal settlements, given volatility that comes with severe impoverishment, and given the added burden that hosting diverse participatory studios within university timeline can place on community-based organizations. Grounded research in informal settlements has instead involved being available to community leadership over many years, attending meetings when requested and documenting these under an ethics clearance framework and with consent. At the same time, master's and PhD students have researched and are currently researching development-related aspects in these settlements. Pedagogy in CUBES has, on the one hand, immersed various classes across architecture and planning in studio areas. On the other hand, informal settlement, in informal settlement, CUBES' pedagogy has involved annual postgraduate student field visits, while also bringing community leaders into the classroom annually to impart their knowledge in discussion with other stakeholders in their development trajectories. We have used this to change the perceptions of postgraduate students, who often are government officials or consultants, as both informal settlements, which I discuss in this presentation, are on a trajectory of informal settlement upgrading. They are living case studies providing different lessons as they evolve from year to year. In relation to the two case studies, I have to acknowledge Neil Klug and Kristen Konienko, who have shared the task of supporting and advising Slovo Park and Harry Gwala informal settlements respectively with me. Turning back to Harry Gwala and Slovo Park's trajectory, the two settlements have had a similar development trajectory in many respects. For residents of both settlements, the legal tenure status changed with the enactment of post-apartheid legislation in 1998, from illegal squatting to unlawful occupation, which applies now to both settlements to date still. The tenure status provides protection against arbitrary eviction and requires provision of alternative accommodation should eviction go ahead. Subsequent case law in the Constitutional Court also requires meaningful engagement should relocation be required. Both settlements have also achieved a status of administrative recognition as they have entered into a protracted pipeline for development. In both cases, the municipality has planned for relocation to new housing developments at a distance of 10 to 15 kilometers. Both communities resisted relocation, resorting to pro bono legal assistance in doing so. In Harry Gwala, some households voluntarily did relocate, particularly from a part of the settlement which was a former mine dump. In both cases, in 2004, in both cases, in 2004 in the case for Harry Gwala and in 2011 in the case of Slovo Park, I was introduced to the community leadership through the pro bono legal representatives who sought policy and planning advice for the leadership as they were opposing eviction. In the case of Harry Gwala, this was the pro bono unit of a leading law firm, Weber Wenzel. In the case of Slovo Park, it was the Socio-Economic Rights Institute of South Africa, and there's an ongoing relationship between us and these organizations. In both cases, the grounds for relocation were cited as unsuitability of the land for permanent residential development. In both cases, this could be disputed for large portions of the land. In the case of Slovo Park, the leadership resorted to litigating with a Milani judgment in the High Court in 2016, requiring that the settlement be developed through the upgrading of Informal Settlements program. In the case of Harigwala, a protracted legal engagement between the civic organization and the municipality from 2004 to 2008 had the municipality concede to the developability of a large portion of the occupied land. The community leadership in both settlements sought to demonstrate feasibility for in situ upgrading based on the existing layout. They did so by leaning on university-based expertise, Pretoria University's architecture department in the case of Slovo Park, and Cubes in the case of Harigwala. In both cases, these support teams prepared feasible in situ upgrading layout plans with engineering designs. In both cases, the municipalities dismissed these plans. In Slovo Park, this led the Community Development Forum to resort to its litigation. Both settlements were for many years unserviced. In both cases, the representative community organizations engaged their municipalities consistently for basic services, for basic service delivery, and managed to secure a minimal number of communal taps. In Slovo Park, the Community Development Forum took it upon itself to raise the funds to tap into the communal water line to provide each plot with a water tap. Slovo Park Community Development Forum managed to secure ventilated, improved pit latrines for each plot. These are sealed and have to be desludged regularly. There has been at least one case of a child drowning in one of these, so they are not really safe forms of sanitation. The Harigwala Civic Committee in 2008, as a last resort, started litigation for improved basic services while awaiting the outcome of a promised but long delayed study into the feasibility for in situ upgrading. The High Court ordered the implementation of additional taps. Only as the Civic Committee took its proceedings to the Constitutional Court did Ekurhuleni Metropolitan Municipality undertake to provide all its informal settlements with shared chemical toilets, the most expensive form of sanitation. And this has seen large contracts for companies over a decade now. Residents in both informal settlements continue to resort to various forms of household energy, including informal electricity connections. The two informal settlement trajectories have diverged in the form that permanent development will take. After seeking in situ upgrading that would respect the existing layout for 10 years, since the adoption of the upgrading of informal settlements program into South African policy, the Harigwala Committee conceded to pressure. In 2016, it conceded to a redevelopment plan for which a disruptive implementation process has begun. Slovo Park Community Development Forum has remained resolute in insisting on an in situ upgrade. For 4 years after the High Court judgment, which requires this route for Slovo Park, the upgrading project is still only at the early stages, that is in Slovo Park. But in Harigwala, the Civic Committee, in giving up its hope for in situ upgrading, read its municipality well. The Housing Department categorically understood it as its own prerogative to define informal settlement upgrading, and it was bent on a housing typology-driven meaning of upgrading, which involves demolition of an informal settlement and redevelopment with an entirely new layout. The municipality's categorical rejection of an in situ upgrading plan that demonstrated feasibility for sensitive and inclusive in situ upgrading, and its insistence that availability of funds would be that the available funds would be spent elsewhere if the community did not accept the redevelopment plan, ultimately swayed the decision. We never imposed our decisions on the community, so all we could do was then support that decision. In 2017, the Harry Gwala Civic Committee has had the difficult task of managing the redevelopment process in the community. So this is over the past 4 years now. This has involved managing relocation, including households with livestock, from one portion of the settlement to an adjacent temporary relocation area, advocating for the improved conditions in the site. And you can see the stormwater channel, for instance, that has been added to the temporary relocation area there. 3 years later, construction of an apartment building on the cleared land has not moved beyond foundation level. The committee engages its municipality weekly and understands the intricacies of the bureaucracy, of suspended officials, unfilled positions, of problems in the contracting processes, mistakenly delayed approval processes, and other aspects of poor municipal governance. Resolute on ensuring a development that ultimately benefits the community, the Civic Committee keeps detailed records, reminds the municipality of its commitments, follows up on progress, and ensures continuity. The Slovo Park Community Development Forum has a similar capacity and commitment to ensuring development that benefits the community. In January 2017, a task team was established between the Community Development Forum and its pro bono representatives and legal representatives, that is, and the municipality with its legal consultants, and Neil Klug and myself as advisors to the Community Development Forum. In October 2017, the Community Development Forum was on the brink of agreeing to a similarly disruptive redevelopment layout plan as similar to that for Harry Gwala. It also involved some plots as well as apartment buildings along the edges. The appointed town planning consultants presented this as the best town plan without tabling any alternative. It bore no resemblance with the existing layout plan. However, given slow progress with the planning, the Community Development Forum had also pursued electrification of the informal settlement. This is possible through a 2012 policy on the electrification of unproclaimed areas, and entails a lower standard of electrification than applied to formal areas. But nevertheless, this gives the appearance of permanence and formality. The municipality's electricity company was planning to reticulate electricity in situ. The divergence between the temporary electrification plan and the town planner's redevelopment plan led the community forum to instruct us to argue against the redevelopment plan in a task team meeting with the municipality. We managed to get the plan shelved. Temporary electrification went ahead, but only in the past 2 months have arrangements been made for a new team of planning consultants and for preparation of an in situ upgrading plan. The realization that several years will pass until this reaches implementation has the municipality has led the municipality to task engineering consultants to develop an upgradable interim sanitation system for Slovo Park. I now turn to try and make sense of this this dilemma that we're facing in these two settlements. So while the dilemma of non-implementation in situ upgrading may be theorized as path dependency, Efforts are nevertheless underway to identify why this is so, and to change this course. It is at this juncture that the two cases are located. What I presented results from the privilege of having accompanied, often with colleagues in cubes, representative community organizations at their invitation, in their strategizing and in their interaction with government bureaucracy. We were able to offer detailed understanding of applicable policy, experience, analysis, and ideas. Over several years, our role has also involved documenting trajectories, interactions, understandings, and interpretations. In both cases, the long-serving community leadership has developed a nuanced and fine-grained understanding of applicable programs and processes and of the bureaucracy, but also of the failure and dysfunctionality. The community organization's meticulous record keeping and institutional memory is a counterpoint to the unstable local government with high turnover of key staff, misinterpretation of policy, poorly explained delays, and backtracking on decisions made. As Rogers suggests, urban development processes cannot necessarily be deemed rational. And the absence of rationality are signs of dysfunctionality. Aligning my analysis with Claire Bini-Bafou, who led a collective within Cubes, which explored practices of the state in urban governance, I find that the two cases don't allow for too simple an assessment of the relationship between local government and community organizations. The relationship between the representative community organizations and the two informal settlements and the respective municipalities don't fit into the often used frame of clientelism or patronage, which assumes a form of rationality, though not necessarily legitimate. And on the part of the state. The two case studies also do not suggest a mere messy reality, given the community organization's persistent engagement, relentless follow-up, and insistence on rules being applied. Urban planning forms an important component in the development trajectory of the two cases I present. In South Africa, planning scholarship from Cape Town has critiqued the planning discipline and its practice for its rationality, whether top-down or more recent consensus-seeking rationality. This scholarship identifies a clash or conflict between the rationality of planning and the rationality of those for whom the plans are intended. This is thought to result from deep difference, culturally, materially, and in value systems and worldviews between planning experts and those for whom they plan. The Ruth Massey applies the notion of rationality differently in a case of other informal settlements upgrading projects in Cape Town. Her approach is to examine local government's rationality as a component of its governmentality. Here, the inquiry is less about the rationality of planners and rather about motivating the motivating rationality that drive the municipality to implement upgrading. This rationality revolves primarily around formalization of informality for the purposes of revenue collection. In the two cases that I discuss, the implementation delays over many years suggest the absence of this as a driving rationality. The planning in the two cases, though receiving approval by the seemingly dysfunctional bureaucracy, displays a high level of arbitrariness and more spatial inefficiency than can be deemed rational according to modern town planning. In short, it is bad planning by modernist terms and nonsensical by any other terms. In the context of weak and failing bureaucracy, an approved plan, whether rational and implementable or not, appears to assume a stabilizing status, though not in a productive sense. Long-standing and highly committed community representatives in both cases grasp the plans and their shortcomings well, and manage the difficult work of translating aspects of implementation into the lived reality of residents, of which the planning is ignorant. Such planning solutions and their spatial outcomes are not new to the residents. They understand the formal areas bordering their informal settlements as products of such planning, with an as good as it gets attitude, meeting a take it or leave it attitude from planners and municipal municipal project managers. Achieving this is what residents and their representatives resort to in the case of Harigwala. In the case of Slovo Park, the leadership has gone a step further to commit to trailblazing an in situ upgrading plan according to the applicable policy confirmed through the judgment that they secured, and that keeps being their reference point. This allowed them to force the municipality to shelve an irrational yet approvable plan, which resulted from a costly planning consultancy. So whereas as a collective in Cubes, we are yet we're yet to fully make sense of the two unfolding development trajectories, one conclusion can be made that the leaders that represent informal settlement communities are capable of playing a far more central role in informal settlement development processes. As we are managing to bring questions of planning and project management and procurement processes for informal settlement upgrading into the agenda of municipal and national governments, national engagements, there is a need to consider how to move beyond the current tacit and entirely unresourced responsibilities that community leadership carries, and how to move towards the people-driven development that the early post-apartheid government promised but failed to craft. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Marie. That was a fascinating comparison of those two cases, and so much to learn as we in India continue to have our own similar stories of various communities trying to articulate and struggle over issues of relocation versus in situ redevelopment, and particularly in the context of Delhi, where recently there's been a Supreme Court order asking all settlements along the railway lines to be sort of cleared, and there's a lot of pushback on that, and it's in negotiation around what it means to trade off these various options. I'd like, people haven't really typed in their questions, but I know we have 37 people on this, listening in. So why don't people raise hands, and maybe we can sort of invite you to ask. I think Arkaja has raised hand. Arkaja, I'm going to send you an invite to speak and ask your question.
Hi, Marie. Thanks, Mukta, for this. I'm interested in the point you made about the competing rationalities of urban planning and the municipality and the slum communities. I mean, at some level, it's an obvious point, but the conflict between the rationalities between the state, the competing rationalities of urban planning and the communities is fairly evident. But I wonder if you could unfold a little bit the competing rationalities within what the municipalities are doing, and what the urban planners in the municipality may be doing vis-a-vis the municipality or other parts of it.
Yes. Would you like me to answer right away?
Yes, if you can, if you would like to.
Yeah, no.
Okay.
So, yeah, absolutely answer this, and then I think a couple of other questions are coming up, and we'll if there are too many, we'll take them in bunches, but if it's one at a time, we can just answer them as we go
Okay.
along.
Okay. So the point I think that these cases are making about the conflicting or competing rationalities is that the conflict is not really between the community leaders and the municipality. The community leaders understand the rationality well, and they are the ones that are managing that, translating that rationality to the lived reality in the community, which is very different from the cases that we have from in the literature from Cape Town. But yes, indeed, the whole notion of competing rationalities is really worth exploring further. So what we were finding is that the informal settlement upgrading is located in the housing departments in municipalities, whereas the planning departments sit quite at a distance and don't see it as their job to be facilitating in situ upgrading, but rather regulating. And so we were seeing the planning consultants actually playing to that and saying, well, you've tasked us with getting a plan through approval. The only plan that can be approved is this one. For XYZ reasons, we can't do an in situ plan. And this is although the housing policy with the upgrading of informal settlement program actually states that standard planning regulations don't apply in in situ upgrading, that the exceptions can be made. So these are the kind of competing rationalities which still need to be bridged, and it's interesting that there is currently a sort of a national discussion on that. And I think for the first time now, the importance of bringing planning on board with informal settlement upgrading is coming to the fore. And so quite excitingly, Neil Klug and I were in a meeting recently in a little workshop with the municipality, city of Johannesburg, where they brought their planners in, and there was a discussion about how planning can better support in situ upgrading. That is a fantastic opening for us. We don't have that opening happening in the Ekurhuleni Metropolitan Municipality, and somehow the train has passed, or the train has left the station in terms of it's too late to go back to in situ upgrading in the Harigwala case, although often we kind of still think, after 3 years of delay and still nothing actually happening on the ground, how can it be that they can't reopen the discussion? But projects, once they are approved and once there is some other funding commitment, they, even if they're delayed for many, many years, somehow have a reality in a municipality that sticks. Yes, so.
Thanks, Marie. Champaka, do you want to ask your question? I've unmuted you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Mukta. And thank you for this fascinating paper. I was really looking forward to being part of the discussion here. Through some secondary research and through involvement with planners from Johannesburg, I understand that the capital investment planning process in Johannesburg fosters a good degree of spatial and financial transparency in terms of the projects that are committed over a 5-year period, as well as through annual budgetary allocation as well for projects. I also have an understanding that the CIP mechanism is an evolving plan where changing local needs are also accommodated. So I was just curious to understand how the two projects you presented actually are integrated or not with the CIP process. Thank you.
Yeah, go ahead, Marie. I think the other question on the table is quite different from this one. So maybe you can take this and then we can move to the other one.
Yes. Okay. So in my understanding, these projects are not linked to this mechanism. The funding is through the human settlement urban USDG, Urban Settlement Development Grant, which municipalities get from Treasury directly, and where Treasury at the moment has something called a window where it is requiring a certain percentage of that to be used for in situ upgrading. And so Slovo Park, for instance, currently has an allocation of 8 million rand, or 10 million, 8 million rand, and there's a discussion about what can be done with that in the absence of an approved plan. And so again, the funding is being used. It's being used for a planning consultant. It's being used for an engineering consultant that will look at services, but still not for any concrete implementation. How the electrification budgets work, that is a topic of one of my PhD students, and I have to read his chapter on that. But he has been trying to find out how City Power, the electrification kind of company, as well as Eskom, the national electricity entity, their budgets work in the electrification of these settlements. What is required is that in these, you mentioned the 5-year plans, and they are the 5-year integrated development planning. This is that cycle that happens, and linked to that are the budgets. And these informal settlements do have to appear on the IDPs, and that is a breakthrough that happened at the time when general understanding was achieved that these settlements were upgradable. So Slovo Park is on dolomitic land, meaning that parts of it are not upgradable, but that actually was only once they did detailed drilling, which is quite expensive, that could be established. And Harigwala was thought to be on mining land, but that was cleared and it isn't, and so those were the kind of, so they are now in their integrated development plans, but the budgets for this come through the housing allocations and through these urban settlement development grants.
Thank you so much. That clarifies so much for me. Thank you.
Thanks, Champika, for your question. Mari, there's a question from Benjamin Ajabuin, who he's asked me to read it out. The question is, how will you describe the relationship between the central and local government in terms of planning delivery? Were there any deadlocks from these two levels of governance in the project implementation?
Yes, hi, Benjamin, thank you. So the planning is, so for Harigwala, it was very much the provincial government that was appointing its professional team, including planners, and not involving the municipality. And this preceded the 2013 Special Land Use Management Act, which has subsequently made planning really a municipal function, and so that planning should happen at municipal level. What has happened is that there's been a big frustration for Treasury that the urban settlements development grant was not being spent on informal settlement upgrading, and as a result, then there is a national body called the the National Upgrading Support Program that then in the metros, it took it upon itself to appoint planners to come up with upgrading plans for a whole lot of informal settlements to allow the Treasury budget to be released in those settlements. What we found suddenly was a consultant, a nationally appointed consultant, had come up with a new upgrading plan for Slovo Park. And we happened to see the upgrading plans for several other settlements as well at the time, and they were really copy and paste plans. They were really not to be taken seriously. Again, they made very little planning sense, but the municipality managed to use them to at least secure the budget. And in that sense, they were important. So there is at least a kind of connection between, there's an attempt to connect planning and budgeting in this way.
Prajita, do you want to ask your question next? Unmute and ask.
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much for the paper and all the activism that has gone in to make your research. you find either or the one. You very rarely find both together. I was wondering about the particular interests that were keeping these communities illegal, or their like illegality was sort of creeping into their living spaces gradually. It wasn't a sudden move. It's sort of, from what you were telling me, telling us, it seemed like a gradual litigation after litigation sort of. So who are the people who are surrounding these communities? The last map that you showed of Slovo Park redevelopment plan had just across the highway a township called El Dorado Township, Park Township. And what are these townships? Are they in any way helping this whole process come through? Yeah, what's their interest in all of this? Where, yeah, the labor aspect, basically.
That's a very nice question. So in Hariguala, I mentioned that the adjacent township is Wattville, and Hariguala sees itself very much as part of Wattville and is part of a civic organization that covers the entire Wattville, with a number of formal areas that still don't have title deeds, for instance, as well as a few informal settlements. And because Hariguala has been under eviction threat, over the years it has been so committee for the actual project of this now redevelopment project happening in Hariguala. The chairperson of the Wattville steering committee is represented, and that is a person that the Hariguala committee leans on a lot as well for advice and for solidarity and guidance and so on. So there's a very good relationship there. And there has been an understanding from the beginning. So Wattville was a township that was very close to the white town of Benoni, and there was a need. It was very overcrowded in Wattville, and there was a need for expansion. And the apartheid government resisted expanding, although there was vacant land that it owned around Wattville, because it wanted to see the entire settlement move for the purposes of segregation. And as the apartheid state began to crumble in the early 90s, several settlements were formed on the edges of Wattville, with the understanding that these would become formal extensions of Wattville. And so the relationship really is one of, for them it's common sense that the settlement should be formalized and become part of Wattville. In the other settlement, yes, correctly, El Dorado Park is the closest formal area, and that is across a very high-level highway. So the relationship isn't that close. There's a real barrier between the two, although there's a road that connects them. It's predominantly also a different cultural group, but there isn't any negativity between, no contestation between these two settlements. It's perhaps more a matter of Slovo Park having to lead its struggle on its own. But the formalization has never been opposed by the El Dorado Park community, to my knowledge, and the adjacent industrial area seems, we're also not aware of any tension there. Why this continued intention over so many years to relocate these informal settlements is something that goes down to how housing departments manage informal settlements and have managed informal settlements over many years. And in Ekurhuleni prides itself on having something that it calls a migration plan, which is basically a plan with a whole lot of arrows of which informal settlement will be moved where, and a bit like a chess game. that is, of course, a very, very disruptive type of approach. And the officials themselves say that with that approach, they've never been able to get ahead of the informal settlement game, because with every one of those relocations, there are people that don't qualify for housing, or that for whom the relocation distance is too far, and they do move back and new informal settlements form. So they never really managed to reduce the number of informal settlements or people living in informal settlements through these projects. City of Johannesburg has abandoned that kind of approach, has now gone ahead and categorized its informal settlements according to those which are upgradable, those which are really under risk and needing to relocate for that reason, and others like Sloper Park that are not under any immediate risk, but they haven't been on any priority either, and there are many of those, and we're also trying to draw attention to the problem of this category. It's called B2, in which informal settlements are treated as temporary areas for decades, really, and have to live with interim services and are not able to build in brick. What has happened in Sloper Park after the electrification is that just has signaled such a permanence that and for many people a sense that in situ upgrading is happening, that people have started building in brick quite extensively, and the leadership is aware that shouldn't happen, but isn't able to stop it from happening. Sorry, so that was quite a roundabout answer.
Not at all. We're all into roundabout answers here. Valerie Clark, I've unmuted you. Why don't you? Yeah.
Okay. Can you hear me? Thank you, Mari, for a very interesting and fascinating case that you are debating here. I just have a question, and I'm interested in the fact that you went into this rational competition, because I've worked on that question, the competition on rational towards informal settlement, but more in Syria, and it was more between institutional ministries and municipality. And I found that the housing departments or ministry were more for relocation, while urban planning were more for, well, not all, but more for upgrading, in situ upgrading. In fact, and in other places like municipality, they were like competing inside the institution. There was like, if there was some cultures, micro-local cultures of professional cultures, but also for example, in the municipality, they were competing. Some were thinking in a way, some in another way. And I was wondering, because I couldn't work with communities there, and you raised the fact that the communities had different rationales than the authorities and the municipality or local authorities. I don't know exactly the situation in South Africa, and I was wondering, did you found any competing rationale inside the communities themselves in terms of land or image of the city, of value of the land, of value or territory, or I don't know. I was wondering that because we often think the case as this opposition between, okay, like formal, the people who are formalizing or willing that everything is to be formal, and the communities who are acting as they act. So I was wondering, within the community, did you find any rational competition?
Thanks. Yes. So thanks so much for sharing that. I'll definitely look out for your study. That sounds fascinating. My involvement has not included any interviewing and engagement with residents in any systematic way, but Kristen Kornienko did her PhD on Harigwala and subsequently was tasked with developing this participatory in situ upgrading plan, and then in in the process of both of those, she did get to know quite a lot. I was supervising her PhD, and it was evident, as in any community, really, there are many, many different characters. There are quite a few artists living in these settlements with their very particular worldview. There are business people who benefit to some extent from the informality. There are people with more temporary commitment to the area, and others that have really made this place their home. So I think there's a diversity. What happened in both informal settlements is that competing community organizations emerged, and that were for relocation. And it's interesting how this happened in both settlements. Both it was highly charged whenever these individuals entered any of the meetings. They were, in both cases, they were invited by the councillor, rather by the political representative. They were not officially part of any proceedings, but were brought in, and they appeared to have been set up. They never had any proven following in the community. So there was an underhand kind of process, which seems to be a way of operating in the sort of dysfunctional parts of the municipality, where communities are set up internally to compete, and rival community organizations are set up to basically support certain interests of. We suspect that there were real interests in having that plan that was shelved actually implemented in Slovo Park. Enormous tendering and the potential for kickbacks, and we're aware how impoverished people are in informal settlements, and how smaller kickback would kind of probably make quite a material difference to people. And so this is a whole nother dimension that is very hard to research, very hard to ask about. Ethics clearance doesn't tend to sort of favor that kind of question in one's research and so on. So we've skirted it a little bit, but I think there's a general awareness that these kind of dynamics are quite real. So I did want to say on the competing rationalities and clashing rationalities that our cases are very different from the ones in Cape Town. I think the traditionalist, particularly in Langa, which is a very old township in Cape Town, where this research around the competing rationalities was taking place, and yeah, so it's not. I wouldn't say it's a framing that fits this particular these particular cases. There isn't this deep difference between planning rationality and informal settlement community rationality. One, because the planning isn't really rational in the first place, and the other is because the community the representative leadership has developed such skills in navigating and understanding the state and planning and processes that there can't be a sort of there isn't that kind of deep difference.
So just to that, I had a question about, and I think, so what's the profile of community leadership, and what kind of support do they come to organizations like you or universities? I mean, so because this is also something I think that comparatively we all struggle with, and I mean, it differs a lot. I mean, there are a lot of things that you're saying are finding resonances with those of us who work on similar issues in other locations. But this is a question that would be, I think, interesting for us to then introspect on. And Partho also had some questions. Maybe he should just come on and say them, and then there may be some common threads and you can answer them together. Is that okay with you? Yeah. Partho, why don't you add your questions in, and then we can bunch them together.
Right. Thanks, Mukta. On this particular issue, Mari, this is fascinating. Is there? I know you said that you didn't have direct interaction with residents, etc. But is it your sense that there may be different groups depending on the nature of their work or the value of the location among the residents? And is it the case that small groups of residents can actually sort of choose to relocate? Or is it an all or nothing kind of situation? And what kind of relocation? I mean, what is the mix of relocation options in that case, in terms of space, in terms of distance? Is there a mix of options available from which one could choose? Like if you go further away, do you get a larger residence? If you are closer, etc. Are there these kinds of structures, or is it a pretty one size fits all kind of stuff? And in some sense, is it one of the things you mentioned is about this long process through which this upgradation issue could actually go through? Are there people within there who just, if there are relocation options available, are the people who just sort of say, it'd be much faster if I just go ahead and relocate somewhere else, and prefer to do that instead? That's one of the issues I thought would be, in addition to the leadership issue that Mukta just put on the table. And if I can just supplement that leadership issue in one sense, which is there a link to the, what is the linkage between, you mentioned the councillor brought in some people, etc. What is the linkage between established political parties or factions and these questions of community leadership? Do these places break along those lines, and are there like people who are patronized by the EFF or ANC or factions within them? How does that structure sort of? It's a long hour. Thanks so much. You get the rough drift of the idea, and then happy to respond to that. Thank
you. Yes, thanks so much. So I'll start with the leadership. So in both cases, the leadership is predominantly male, but does include women. It is leadership that has been in place for a long time, and not necessarily re-elected every year, but at the same time, it's leadership that has the endorsement of the community. So back in 2016, after the court judgment in the Slovo Park case, and the judgment saying that this settlement needs to be upgraded in situ, and the court, it was the Slovo Park Community Development Forum that had taken the municipality to court. The first thing the municipality did was say, well, who are these guys, and are they legitimate? And they questioned that, although of course these court papers are always accompanied with a long list of affidavits of residents showing that support. But so the municipality took it up, but by then again already this rival group had entered several meetings, disrupting and so on. So what the municipality did was a mass meeting at which indeed the Slovo Park Community Development Forum was given a mandate again by the community, and that has since then established who's who and who the leadership is, and they operate in a very, very consistent manner. Part of how they operate is that they are quite closely aligned to the ANC structures in the area. That has not meant necessarily patronage, and indeed, quite sadly, several of the community leadership have passed away in the past 5 years that I've been quite regularly involved, or even in the past 4 years, you know, and it was community's great disappointment that the ANC representatives from that area didn't turn up, you know, at the funerals. So it's not as if that, you know, it is a relationship that they are using because at some point it was an ANC council. It then became a DA council. They tried to build a relationship with the DA mayor, but didn't change their political alliance. Made it very clear who they were. But I think that the Slovo Park Community Forum is also quite unique in the way it navigates the politics. The ward council is not necessarily supportive, and so they have to navigate that as well. In Harigwala, the community development forum is apolitically, categorically, and has been, and yet it has a relationship with the ward councillor because the ward councillor has to represent them. And not so long ago, even in a march that the entire Wattville Steering Committee undertook about the title deeds, the councillor participated in that march, and that was quite an interesting way. The councillor himself was also upset with the way his bureaucracy, or the municipality's bureaucracy, was not responding on this highly overdue matter. So it's again, we're finding that these two cases don't fit what we're learning from the literature from other cases, so they are quite unique. And then the question about whether people have the option to relocate. So in Harigwala, in around 2004, when the civic committee was resisting relocation and eviction, in fact, nevertheless, individual households did accept to be relocated to Chief Albert Lutuli, which is even further towards the east, and it's 15 kilometers from Harigwala. So individuals have moved, and for those individuals that move has made sense pragmatically, but the leadership is very committed to the area, as are many of the residents who've decided to stay. But in Slovo Park, that has not really been the case. Again, it's as I mentioned, it's a highly structured community with its block system and leadership, and people that have staked out plots over, you know, since the early 1990s, and are very attached to those places. The option they do have, and many people are on the housing demand database, they have submitted these application forms for housing subsidies, and in an ideal world, they would eventually in the waiting list come up at some point and be told that a house is ready for them to move to somewhere. But there isn't much choice in that process, and there is a huge backlog, and so there are still people on the waiting list from the 1990s, to the great embarrassment of many politicians. So it isn't. We've often argued that, especially in very dense informal settlement, it's important to include the option to relocate, and to allow households that wish to relocate to move, and in fact to have relocation sites ready at that point to avoid having to park people in temporary relocation areas before they can be allocated. The reality is that in Johannesburg and Ekurhuleni, there are many temporary relocation areas in which people have lived for 5, 10 or more years and are also on the waiting list somewhere, or they don't qualify for housing, and they are parked there in the interim and their lives remain uncertain and so on. So, you know, that I'm just painting the bigger picture. And unfortunately, an individual informal settlement can be seen as being privileged unfairly if a relocation is prioritized for those households, or even relocation options are prioritized for those households. What happens rather though is that housing developments get developed, a piece of land is made available, a housing project is developed, and the way the municipality has generally dealt with allocations is to say, okay, well, this informal settlement we will receive, we will create a new community, is the word, by having 30% of households from Eikenhof informal settlement, 30% from Thembelihle informal settlement, 30% from Protea South, and that is just the example of high housing development on the southern periphery of Johannesburg. How the sort of who got which houses was decided there, and that means suddenly Thembelihle or any of these informal settlements, the leadership is suddenly confronted with this offer to accept so many households in a new area, and then having to decide who moves. And yes, so we're also finding that, you know, that was really part of this kind of migration planning type of approach to housing delivery. But really, at a national level, the consensus across Treasury, housing, planning, and many different ministries is now that the way to go is really in-situ upgrading, to minimize relocations, to be far more sensitive to poverty and so on. Yeah.
Has there been an approach where the idea of in situ is actually not like the very land itself, but something that's really within a very close distance? For example, in Delhi, the local policy states that anything within a 5-kilometer radius is also within the ambit of in situ, which opens up then possibilities of bypassing this transit accommodation business. So, I mean, not that it's been used very effectively, or not that they're really pushing for. I mean, the statement is that they want to do in situ, but there aren't actually too many projects that have happened. But I was just asking about, you know, whether this business of land available in the vicinity has ever come up in any of the cases.
It's interesting because it's only been recently that I've been hearing the municipalities saying, oh, well, now the requirement is if we relocate, it has to be within 5 kilometers. The reality is that most informal settlements, even Slovo Park, because of the dolomite, because it has a low level of dolomite in the majority of the area, those areas have to be, the layout plan in the end has to have quite large plots, and does not allow for subsequent densification, because water ingress is linked to subsidence in the ground, and so there's a sort of a formula about how many people are allowed to occupy a land like that, and so there has to be some de-densification. There's already an agreement on who will move, but there isn't any commitment from the municipality about which land people will move to. So for the past 4 years, the community forum keeps reminding the municipality that it had at some point promised this and that portion of land, which are all very close, much less than 5 kilometers, and so most informal settlement in situ upgrading processes require land to be secured nearby, and ideally that land needs to be developed before the relocation happens, so it's not it doesn't go through this transit. It's interesting now that you know, what I haven't mentioned is that South Africa also has a land reform debate at the moment, and a whole land reform process. It's very late, you know, 25 years after apartheid, this matter is back on the agenda, but for the first time we're talking urban land reform as well. And so the notion of needing to rapidly release land to allow people to settle on land permanently, informally permanently, which will be upgraded and serviced at a later stage, is a notion that is back on the table. and has even been, just last week, the minister made a statement about this, but also about the fact that there basically isn't any budget left for building houses as such. So there will be a kind of a reshift to service sites. It just means that the top structure aspect of housing delivery will be delayed. It doesn't require a policy change as such, but yeah, that's just the current situation. Land remains a highly contentious issue and a highly charged issue for obvious reasons.
I'd like to ask you a somewhat related question about the sort of the material aspects of these two conflict sites, and in terms of the first part of this question is, was it practical? The images that you showed seem to suggest that the settlements aren't very, very dense, and was it possible, first of all, to have conceived of a plan that involved in situ upgrading that didn't involve breaking houses? And in what way, is that something that is acceptable within planning and municipal conventions of how informal settlements may enter the formalizing continuum by being upgraded incrementally upgraded in ways that improve the texture of the settlement but don't necessarily interfere with the housing stock? That's one part of the question. The other part of the question is just about the economics of it, where the money for upgrading was going to come from, how it was to be financed. For the residents themselves, we've got the sense that for some residents, they may have sensed that there was a better deal in agreeing to relocation as opposed to wanting to remain in the same site. But there may be a variety of considerations that different groups of residents might have to consider in that choice. But what was at stake for all of the different parties involved in this conflict in very material terms?
Mari, it didn't unmute, I think.
Sorry, there we go. So this notion of upgrading without interfering in the housing stock, in the existing housing stock, that is really what the in situ upgrading of informal settlements program was intended to achieve by having this principle of minimal disruption and relocation as last resort, and so for both settlements, an in situ plan that would achieve exactly that had been developed by Cubes and Pretoria University for the two settlements. But the reality is that somehow the planning and the project management is so set on norms and standards, conventional norms and standards of urban development, with very wide roads, with standardized plot sizes, with leeways, for services, and there hasn't been a drive for innovation for those standards to be changed. And that again also is currently a national discussion, and the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research is working on revised standards for informal settlement upgrading, so that this obstacle can be overcome. So although the policies argues for that, it doesn't seem to make sense, or doesn't seem to be implementable by the officials that have to drive it, and consultants working on it also don't see that making any sense, and they often come with quite a lot of professional arrogance in making putting their positions forward. But yes, the sort of, and I realize I didn't answer the earlier question about the resources and perhaps the material conditions of the leaders, and the question about how they managed to come to the university and those distances. So if we invite them, we always cover their cost of coming, and their hours as well. But they are regularly expected to make the trip to the municipality's offices are close to Wits University, and yes, they have for a long time, there was one shop owner in Slovo Park who was very generous towards the community organization, and would kind of help with petrol. They do have a small old car, getting them on the road, and so on. But it's not something that we feel necessarily in the trusted position that we're in. It's not something that we would want to poke our nose into how they actually fund, and even how what their livelihoods are in some cases. But indeed, sort of livelihoods are quite diverse in these settlements. So it is interesting to see how the electrification has enabled households to suddenly purchase bricks, and cement, and build in brick. Again, I don't know of any study, and this is not unique to Slovo Park. Many settlements have been electrified. All of them have consolidated incrementally, innovatively, in quite a rapid way. I don't know yet of any research, and I'm looking for a PhD student who could maybe take this on one day. But how households finance this, and what really, how that links to their material reality. Often it is also investment in rental stock, and it makes real sense, economic sense. But of course, it also builds the local economy. It's local builders, it's local material supplies, and so on that benefit from, and it's certainly something that should be encouraged. And we are also trying to get the municipalities to understand that in situ upgrading would involve incremental housing over time, and that is something that should be encouraged and not resisted. So I'm not sure if I really answered that question well, but yeah.
I don't have any other hands up or questions. Would any of the co-panelists with me, any of the others want to add? Remy? Nope. So on this, actually my question was more about, yeah. Remy, you want to say something?
No, Remy seems yeah. Mari, just a quick thing on this electrification vis-a-vis. I know you said this came about through a recent policy document in 2012, but is it the case that residents somehow perceive electrification as an affirmation of tenure of some sort, that they see this as in some sense, the government signaling that they will not be relocated, and therefore they feel more comfortable in investing their own resources in sort of upgrading their own housing stock? Do you have any way that you can have a sense of that?
Yes, that certainly does seem to be the case. Although this particular type of electrification is a lower standard than would be put into a permanent area, it definitely signals, and for many communities, that is, electrification is really the most important thing for them. Not having electricity, having to rely on informal connections, which are dangerous. Children are electrocuted. At times shacks catch fire because of electrical faults, and the electrification and really makes such a fundamental difference to people's lives. It shouldn't be underestimated. For people no longer to have to use candles, which are also such a risk, shack fires being such a risk. So once electricity is provided, residents also are, they have an individual meter, although it's prepaid, they have a connection with the state. They are seen by the state. There's a whole lot of that kind of that recognition, and in that sense, again, and we haven't in both settlements, we haven't done the kind of empirical work with interviews and getting to understand how individual households have responded and understood the electrification. It's more from observation and also from listening to the community leaders. So what happened in Slovo Park was that once the electrification happened, some households increased the rent for their tenants, and they felt that was justified. There was a demand. People were keen to move in because there was electricity and were able to pay more, and that did displace some of the people that were actually, according to the judgment, to be included in the upgrading program. They were tenants at the time. They had rights to that upgrading, but they have subsequently been displaced. So there's also, there's that kind of dynamic that happens with all service delivery, especially with our rental markets, that benefits of that get reaped by landlords.
Maitri, do you want to ask your question?
I can't hear. I'm sorry, I can't hear. I think my audio is not working. But if you can hear, in that case, let me just make this put up this question to Marie. On the issue of relocation from the occupied lands to the recognized colonies, on this particular issue, I would like to ask whether in Johannesburg case, the municipalities or whether the provincial governments, for that matter, they have any proper records of people who actually put up in these unrecognized colonies. And if so, that is, if they really have, is it on household basis or is it on individual basis? What kinds of documentation do they actually have regarding this? This is my question.
Thanks, Maitri.
Yes, that's quite an important question. So on the whole, the records of who's living in an informal settlement are not detailed and are not accurate. There is a turnover, so those records are also, when they are made out, they're quickly outdated. There've been efforts. I mean, you'll be very familiar with Slum Dwellers International. They also have their affiliates here. They've been promoting enumerations, and they don't talk about it much, but there is a network of informal settlements called the Informal Settlement Network, which is supported by the SDI affiliate, which at various moments had tried to get municipalities, make municipalities aware of all informal settlements by providing enumeration data. It was of different standards, not always useful for municipalities, but they've also tried to improve their approaches. But for instance, Slovo Park, Slovo Park, after the judgment, what the municipality had to do was establish that the community forum was legitimate, but also then conduct a social survey in which it captured households, household heads, and household members, and basic demographic data, and that is kept, and the community forum has a copy of it, and that is sort of the register. The way the thinking is going at the moment at national level is that informal settlement communities should enter into what is called a social compact with municipalities, which is a kind of an agreement which would replace the judgment in the case of Slovo Park, which is kind of, this is it, it's an agreement, it's secured. It has to be implemented, and within that social compact would also be a kind of a register of who will be benefiting from this project, who are the legitimate people that will be. Whether or not that's really going to work in reality, given the transience and given the fluidity of informal settlements, is another question. And in Cape Town, there's been a lot of conflict around informal settlements that have attracted additional people just as development started, which then becomes a problem. It's considered a problem because it isn't anticipated. If it's anticipated, adjacent land is made available for overspill and for accommodating those people. But it's been to the point that one has been saying, don't even think about doing an city upgrading without anticipating that happening and therefore plan for it. Yeah. Yes, I think that more or less covers that.
Thank you. We were intrigued by the idea of renters being eligible for the relocation housing, because that's something that we struggle with a lot here, at least in the Indian context, with them not having all of the cutoff and the eligibility requirements and renters being left out, and also the idea of renters actually finding their way to transit camps, because they often get evicted. They don't even get the space in the transit camp sometimes. So is this part of the legal framework, or is this like negotiated on a municipal basis?
That's interesting. So the pro bono lawyer who's supported the Harry Gwala committee for many years, Murray Hawthorne, he time and again told the leadership that in law, everybody living in that informal settlement is an unlawful occupier and has the same status. Although within the settlement, they differentiate between the status of structure owner or plot owner and tenant. In law, they are unlawful occupiers and they have the same rights. And he kept bringing up this argument, saying that he could only represent this community if all the tenants were included. He would not be willing to help in any way if it was only going to be for the ones that consider themselves owners. And he made that principled sort of statement again and again. In reality, municipalities tend to treat the tenants as more disposable, and often it is the tenants that are moved to transit camps. It's the tenants that have to accept that their rights are not as secure as the people that were there first and staked out their plots. I'm not sure whether this will come up in litigation over time and be refined in a sort of a legal, in terms of how the law treats it. But it does seem that tenants are definitely visible to the municipality. In South Africa also has an enormous amount of people living in the backyards of subsidized housing, backyard tenants. There was a stage at which backyard rental was growing at a faster rate than informal settlements, and there have been quite a few new land occupations during the COVID lockdown. One of them is called COVID. It's been in the media a lot, and those are people spilling out of rental accommodation in the backyards. People have lost their jobs. People are not able to pay rent. People are, don't have really much option. So there is this the rental population is also on the radar of housing departments. It's a big worry to them, and they're often seen to be prioritizing informal settlements. Politically, that can be quite a volatile situation. They also have to be seen to be doing something for this pent up housing demand in the backyards. Yes, so yeah, in the rental market.
Thank you.
It would be very interesting doing a comparison or doing more comparisons. I'm learning so much from these questions as well.
Yeah, I will write to you separately on that, Marie. I mean, there's a lot here which can be compared, at least across India and South Africa, and I'm sure other cases can be.
Yes, yes, and I want to mention another colleague, Margot Rubin, whose own PhD was on a comparison, but more around litigation and how constitutional court cases in India and South Africa, what they meant for urban governance, but also very fascinating work and just showing us how much there's to be learned from from this. Yes.
And on that
Yes,
note,
Mari, Margot is actually a good friend because Margot, Phil, um, and then Rob Moore and Ivan Turok are part of this thing we've got the BRICS
Yes.
city.
Oh, yes, yes, of course. Fantastic.
So,
Yes.
so Isha and I and a bunch of others have been involved with that initiative for some time. Absolutely.
Yes, so I'm sure I'm going to, I would be meeting you at some point.
At some point
Yes,
time.
yes.
But lovely to have you present this. This has been extremely illuminating for most of us here. Thank you so much.
Thank you
Thanks.
so much, and thank you everyone who was here and who was so engaged with the conversation today.
Yes, thanks, and I also enjoyed it very much. Thank you. Okay.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye then. Bye.